My name is Barbara Romzek, and I'm Dean of the School of Public Affairs. I'd like to welcome you all here tonight on this important lecture, and I want to recognize Dean Starr is in the audience as well, Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences. I remind you that tonight's lecture is an annual event that is named in honor of a former professor in the School of Public Affairs, Amos Perlmutter. He taught at the university from 1972 until his death in 2001. He was an expert in comparative politics and foreign affairs. Hence, the topic for tonight is appropriate for his lecture. He was a senior advisor on foreign policy matters related to Israel and the Middle East. And he worked with the UN, the Israeli Defense Forces, the Greek government, the Brookings Institution, and U.S. Senate Foreign Committees on Foreign Policy, and that's just to name a few. Amos was a true public intellectual, and this annual lecture honors his contribution to the university and the global community at large. As for tonight's lecture, I would like to thank Saul Newman and our colleagues in the School of Public Affairs for their hard work and the Center for Israeli Studies for their help in organizing this seminar. This is truly a special evening. I'm sure you are all thrilled, as I am, to have Ambassador Indyk as our special guest this evening. He has done important work on Palestinian negotiations and Middle East peacemaking. I'm looking forward to hearing his perspective on these topics. This evening's topic is one of the more pressing public policy issues of our day. And while we no longer have Dr. Perlmutter with us, we have current SPA faculty members who continue to explore these issues. One example is Dr. Thomas Zaitzoff. His work focuses on understanding ethnic violence in Israel and several other areas around the globe. His research examines why individuals participate in political violence. He also examines the political and psychological effects of exposure to violence. Now, beyond research, we in SPA know we are accountable to more than our academic peers, to the students we teach, and the departments we lead. We are also accountable for educating the broader public about the pressing public affairs issues of our day. As such, we are constantly working to ensure that we are engaged on the important issues of the day, and tonight's lecture is an example of just that. Thanks to all in our audience for continuing to support our lectures and the events that we hold in SPA. It's gratifying to see our programming is appreciated and that we have such great attendance. A pitch right here for space issues in the American University. If any of you are in the neighborhood, we could use a little more space. Tonight's speaker, Ambassador Martin Indyk, will be introduced by Professor Michael Brenner, who is the Seymour and Lillian Abinson Chair in the Seymour and Lillian Abinson Chair in Israel Studies and Director of the Center for Israel Studies. Michael.
Thank you, Barbara, for this introduction and for the continuing cooperation and collaboration between SPA and the Center for Israel Studies. And we do work with all the schools at AU, and we're really proud to have this very interdepartmental working relationship and position within AU. It is indeed a special privilege for me to introduce tonight Ambassador Indyk, and I think the audience and the numbers in the audience and also the many students show the real interest not only in the topic but also in the speaker tonight. Ambassador Indyk, I would say there are very few people who know the Middle East process more intimately and maybe who have also gone through more trouble in healing and repairing it over the recent years and in fact decades than Dr. Indyk has. He served as U.S. Ambassador to Israel twice, once from 1995 to 1997 and once from 2000 to 2001. Both, as you might remember, times of high hopes, but also of big disappointments in the end in terms of Middle East peace negotiations. More recently, Ambassador Indyk was the U.S. Special Envoy for the Israeli-Palestinian negotiations. He has now returned to Washington, where he is the Brookings Institution's Executive Vice President and also a former director of its foreign policy program. Previously, he has served as special assistant to President Clinton and was senior director for Near Eastern and South Asian affairs at the National Security Council and assistant secretary of state for Near Eastern affairs in the U.S. Department of State. Before entering the U.S. government, Dr. Indig was founding executive director of the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. Ambassador Indig received a bachelor's degree in economics from Sydney University and a PhD from Australian National University. He's the author of several books, among them Innocent Abroad, an intimate account of American peace diplomacy in the Middle East. And most recently, I believe, he co-authored a book called Bending History, Barack Obama's Foreign Policy. I am very much, and I'm sure all of us are very much looking forward to tonight's lecture entitled Order from Chaos, the Challenges of Restoring Order in the Middle East. And I have no doubt there will be a lively discussion afterwards. Please join me in welcoming Ambassador Indig.
Thank you very much, Michael. I apologize for those of you who have to stand this evening. But I'm very glad to be here, especially on this occasion, to honor the memory of Amos Perlmutter. When I was invited to give this memorial lecture, I immediately accepted because Amos was a good friend of mine, and more importantly, probably a very close friend to my mentor, Zev Schiff. That's how I met Amos in Israel. Where he was very much at home in Tel Aviv. I remember him talking with great affection about the days in which he would get up in the morning, go swimming at the Tel Aviv pool on the beachfront, and then hang around with his friends and talk Israeli politics. Moving to Washington was a big shift for him, but it never took the Israeli out of him. He was a great analyst and strategic thinker. He was, of course, a realist, but he was also a very clear-headed in terms of his aspirations for Israel and his desire to see Israel secure and at peace. I just recently moved my office because I was kicked upstairs to be executive vice president of Brookings, and I came across his volume on military, the Israeli military and politics in Israel. And it's a wonderful volume, even now still very relevant in terms of his analysis of the role of the military in Israeli politics. But I remember that Amos had written many articles, and I looked up a couple of them for this occasion, and I thought it was typical that what he wrote then is so prescient and so accurate even today with everything that has happened. There is this wonderful article in Foreign Affairs. He wrote often for the journal Foreign Affairs, which is the preeminent foreign policy publication in the United States. This was in the May-June issue of 1995. That was barely 2 years after the signing of the Oslo Accords on the White House lawn, September 13th, 1993. The title that he gave to this article was "The Israel-PLO Accord is Dead." I don't know how many times that's been written and declared, most recently by the outgoing UN Special Envoy in his speech, declaring that the Oslo Accord is dead. But in this article, way back then, he explained how the accord was already coming apart because both sides were backing away from their commitments. The Palestinians were not living up to their commitments to stop terrorism, and the Israelis were not living up to their commitments not to change the status quo. That is to say, they were still building settlements. And he focused on the rising tide of militant Muslim Palestinian nationalism. He said in that article, Middle East peace process may stagger on, but the Oslo Accord will never yield its desired fruit. More than 20 years later, that happens still to be the case. In various other ways, he was prescient in terms of his assessment of the situation that Israel found itself in. He was quick to argue that a PLO-led government is he said back then, completely unsuited to the task of establishing a pluralistic democratic state with strong civil institutions. And his ability to understand the dynamics of politics led him to the conclusion in another Foreign Affairs article that was written earlier in 1994 that only Hamas has the kind of popular support to represent a viable alternative to the PLO. And he predicted back then that free elections in Gaza and the West Bank would only serve to bring Hamas to power. Amazing. I know that his colleagues here, certainly for me, we miss him greatly for the twinkle in his eye, the smile on his face, and his acerbic ability to read the map. It's that map that I want to talk about today, the map of the Middle East. Because we live in a world now in which chaos seems to be engulfing us. At any particular moment, it feels like the wheels are coming off the international order. Russian aggression in the Ukraine, Chinese assertiveness in the South China Sea, but most particularly the collapse of order in the Middle East. And the spreading chaos there is deeply alarming. Why are we in this situation is a question that I think can be answered by looking back, if you'll indulge me for a moment, since you are a semi-academic audience, to do a little bit of history. The order that has collapsed in the Middle East, as many of you will know, was established in the wake of the First World War, when the British and the French took control of the Middle East, filled the vacuum left by the collapse of the old order that was established by the Ottomans, who were, of course, defeated in the First World War. The French and the British divided up the Middle East, drew the boundaries. You remember the Sykes-Picot Accords, which established the borders of modern Lebanon, Syria, Iraq. And through the Second World War, they essentially dominated the region and maintained order there. After that, the British slowly withdrew after the Second World War, could not maintain their commitments to dominate the region, similarly with the French. And the United States began to fill the vacuum, seeking to establish order there in the midst of Cold War rivalry with the Soviet Union. And the United States supported the status quo powers, mainly the Arab sheikhs and kings in the Gulf, Saudi Arabia, Jordan, across to Morocco. And the Soviet Union backed the radical nationalist, revisionist states that emerged in the wake of the Second World War and the rise of Arab nationalism. In particular, Egypt under Nasser was supported by the Soviet Union, and the Ba'athist regimes in Iraq and Syria were supported by the Soviet Union. And so the Middle East was very much part of the contest between the United States and the Soviet Union. That all began to change with the advent of Anwar Sadat as president of Egypt and his decision to seek to change the status quo in the region. And he did so by evicting the Russians from Egypt, 1972. He couldn't get the attention of the United States by doing so. And so he went to war in 1973, the famous Yom Kippur War, and then turned to the United States in order to make peace with Israel. That action, in which essentially Egypt moved out of the Soviet camp and into the American camp, as Henry Kissinger shuttled between Egypt and Israel, laying the foundations for the peace process that we've known ever since, that shift marked the beginning of the rise of American dominance in the region through the vehicle of peacemaking, as Kissinger sought to first make peace between Egypt and Israel and then between Syria and Israel. Fast forward again to the invasion of Kuwait by Saddam Hussein, his eviction, the eviction of his army by an American-led coalition, and the simultaneous collapse of the Soviet Union. And those two developments, the collapse of the competing superpower and the eviction of and destruction of the Saddam's army in Kuwait, led to a double blow against the forces that would seek to revise the order or destabilize the order in the region. And with that, the United States became the dominant power. Of course, we became the sole superpower, dominant across the world, but in particular, the United States was dominant in the Middle East. And we therefore took on the role of maintaining a new order there under American aegis. That strategy of maintaining order comprised of three basic components. The first was the Pax Americana that Kissinger had started to lay the groundwork for, still during the Cold War. But now, with the advent of the Clinton administration and the work that George H.W. Bush and his Secretary of State James Baker had done to bring all of the Arab neighbors of Israel and the Palestinians into direct negotiations with Israel, the famous Madrid Conference of 1992, that then laid the groundwork for President Clinton to come in and decide that he would try to resolve the Arab-Israeli conflict by having a comprehensive peace between Israel and all of its neighbors, Palestinians. Israel already had peace with Egypt by that point. Israel, the Palestinians, Israel and Jordan, Israel and Syria, Israel and Lebanon. I had the honor to go into the White House with President Clinton as his Middle East advisor, and I told him in our first meeting that he would have the chance, if he tried, to achieve 4 peace agreements in his first term. And he said, I want to do that. And for 8 years he struggled that effort. It had a breakthrough with the Oslo Accords in 1993 in his first year in office, a peace treaty with Jordan and Israel in 1994, his second year in office. By 1995, when I was sent out as ambassador to Israel, we thought at that point that we would have an Israeli-Syrian agreement within the next 6 months, because Yitzhak Rabin had already told Bill Clinton that Israel was prepared to withdraw from all of the Golan Heights. My job, he sent me out to Israel, was to work with Rabin on that effort. Instead, 5 months later, Rabin was assassinated. And the whole American effort cratered. I'll save you all of the details, but the basic point was that the United States was using the effort to achieve comprehensive peace to solidify the order in the region under an American Pax Americana. The second part of this overall strategy for maintaining order was what we called in those days dual containment, because there were two revisionist powers in the region that we had to deal with. Iraq under Saddam Hussein and Iran under the Ayatollahs. And so we pursued this joint strategy of, on the one hand, trying to achieve peace between Israel and its Arab neighbors, on the other hand, containing Iraq and Iran. The third component was perhaps the most controversial, although dual containment had its detractors in its day. But the third component became highly controversial in subsequent years. And that's what came to be known as Arab exceptionalism. That is to say, we made a decision in those days. This was a follow-on, I would say, from the days of Kissinger and Nixon and George H.W. Bush as well. But it was clearly a decision that we would exempt our Arab allies in this effort to maintain order from any insistence that they promote greater freedom for their own people. The democratic exceptionalism to our policy around the world. We essentially gave them a pass because of a judgment that maintaining order and securing peace was the first priority, and that promoting freedom and democracy could come after we had achieved those objectives. The strategy worked fairly well for a decade, but it all fell apart, as you probably are fully aware, in the wake of 9/11. The United States abandoned the containment of Iraq in favor of regime change, toppling Saddam Hussein in a fairly reckless way that opened the gates of Baghdad to Iran. We can come back to that if you like in Q&A, but the reason that Clinton pursued a containment policy rather than an overthrow policy of Saddam Hussein was precisely out of a concern that if Saddam Hussein were toppled, that this would open the gates of Iraq to Iran. But that was ignored in the wake of 9/11 by George W. Bush in favor of promoting a different kind of order in the region. It was to be an order based on promoting democracy rather than based on maintaining stability. Condoleezza Rice famously argued at the time, for 30 years she said, we've sought to put stability above democracy and we got neither. So now, she said, we're going to pursue democracy. At the same time as the United States turned from maintaining order to actually actively seeking to revise the order, the Arab-Israeli peace process stalled with the outbreak of the Second Intifada at the end of the Clinton administration, and essentially has stubbornly resisted repeated efforts to jumpstart it ever since. And Arab exceptionalism, of course, was abandoned as part of this sense that it hadn't worked. And in the process, the Bush administration helped to produce the Arab revolutions that subsequently swept across the region during the Obama years. in the process, the existing order collapsed and has been replaced today by failing states, ungoverned areas, and the rise of Al-Qaeda and ISIS. One shouldn't be too nostalgic for the old order. It was punctuated by conflicts, coups, and purchased at the price of repression. But its collapse has generated the current conflict, which is a product of a turmoil generated by three conflicts that are causing these incredible cross currents. The first, which is very obvious today, is the Sunni-Shia sectarian conflict that originated in Lebanon between Hezbollah and Sunnis in Lebanon, which Hezbollah won, spread to Iraq as a result of what I have already described, with the Shias taking control in Baghdad and the Sunnis losing control there, and thence to Syria with the outbreak of the rebellion of Sunnis against the Alawite regime of Bashar al-Assad, and lately to Yemen, where the Houthis, who are Zaydis, the Shias, essentially Shias, are in conflict and with Sunnis there, and the Houthis have taken over Sana'a and now heading for Aden, and these conflicts, sectarian conflicts, are supported from the outside by Iran on the one side and Saudi Arabia on the other, and Saudi Arabia, of course, is supported now by Egypt and other Sunni Arab states. So that it's a conflict which has spread and will continue to spread. There's very little in the existing dynamics to prevent this from happening. There's a Shia majority in Bahrain under a Sunni ruler. That's probably the best candidate for the next place. There's a Shia majority, a Shia minority in Saudi Arabia, but it's only about 10% of Saudis, but they are located in the most sensitive region of Saudi Arabia, the eastern province where most of Saudi Arabia's oil is located. So that's one source of chaos. The second is an immensely complicated Sunni-Sunni intramural conflict. And this started with Al-Qaeda versus the Sunni sheikhs and monarchs, but morphed, of course, into ISIS and that conflict against the Sunni Arab order by radical jihadists. But there's also within the Sunni family a conflict which for many of the Sunni leaders, particularly the Egyptians and the Saudis, has been more important than the battle against ISIS, and that is the battle against the Muslim Brotherhood, against political Islamists as opposed to Islamic jihadists. The third conflict, of course, is the age-old one between the Arabs and Israel. And even while the peace treaties between Israel and Egypt and Israel and Jordan have held in the face of this chaos, there have in recent times been 3 wars in 6 years between Israel and Hamas in Gaza, and of course 2 wars between Israel and Hezbollah in Lebanon. And now you see that conflict is beginning to spread to the Golan, with Hezbollah, supported by the Iranians, beginning to try to set up positions in the Golan to operate against Israel. It would be complicated enough to restore order in this situation, given the nature of these cross-cutting conflicts. But the United States has particular difficulty in doing so because its people have grown weary of fighting ground wars in the Middle East, and its president is deeply committed not to starting any new ones. So the stakes for the United States have changed. We essentially are facing a situation in which the traditional role we have played, going back to the Cold War, is one that we essentially no longer wish to play. After one of the longest wars in America's history, the war in Iraq, the failure of our interventions there and in Libya, of course, there is a real sense that we don't know how to do it, and that's compounded by the sense that perhaps we don't need to do it, that the vast expenditure of blood and treasure has been for naught. If anything, we seem only to have contributed to the chaos. And given the shale oil revolution, our dependence on Middle Eastern oil is much less than it used to be. And therefore, our strategic stake in the region has been reduced. So we are, in fact, the reluctant superpower when it comes to the challenge of restoring order in the region, with a president who is a reluctant warrior. And that manifests itself most clearly in Syria, where the president has a deep resistance to the notion of intervening there to try to restore order from the chaos. What is to be done? I'll put it in a short version, and perhaps we can discuss it in the Q&A. My first point is that it is no longer adequate to approach the region in the way that the Obama administration has been doing for the last 2-3 years. And that is what I call a piecemeal approach. Because the president is reluctant to take on the burden of restoring order, he approaches each issue on its merits. So Egypt is a case of a regime that is shooting its own people in the streets and arresting tens of thousands of them. So we have a problem with Egypt and trying to get them to change their attitude towards their own people. With Saudi Arabia, we have a difference over Syria and over Egypt, and so we try to kind of deal with them in a way that makes it difficult for us to have a positive partnership. In the case of Syria, we don't want to get involved. In the case of Iraq, we send in our air power, but we're not prepared to have boots on the ground. There is no overarching strategy because I'm convinced that the president doesn't want an overarching strategy. What would one look like? Well, essentially, we have two options. I'm going to put this simply and fairly crudely, but just for the sake of simplicity to understand the options. But my fundamental point is we have to choose between these two options. We no longer have the luxury of standing back and saying, well, we're not going to try to restore order. The first option is to go back to our traditional approach of relying on partnerships with our friends in the region, traditional allies, Israel, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and Turkey. Turkey, of course, a NATO ally. As I said, we're basically at loggerheads with each one of them. We're certainly at loggerheads with Prime Minister Netanyahu in Israel. That's evident for all to see. That would require us to swallow a lot of things that we object to in their behaviour. What Sisi is doing to his own people, what Netanyahu is doing when it comes to an unwillingness to move ahead seriously on the Palestinian front, what the Saudis are doing in terms of their way in which they're supporting radical Islamic radical Sunni Islamic elements across the region. The alternative to that is to work with Iran. There are many critics of President Obama who say he's already doing that, but I think that is a vast exaggeration based on some kind of conspiratorial notions. It's something that many Arab leaders believe, but I do not believe it's the case. The option of working with Iran would start with a successful conclusion of the nuclear deal, which tonight looks a little bit questionable after the expectation that there would be some kind of breakthrough in the last couple of days. There may yet be. But obviously that option would depend upon being able to complete that deal which put meaningful curbs on Iran's nuclear program. Then we would presumably work with Iran in the way that we did tacitly in Iraq to remove the Prime Minister of Iraq, Nouri al-Maliki, who was creating such problems in Iraq. And the Iranians worked quietly with us to put a new Prime Minister in power who reached out to the Sunnis, provided us with a plausible way to establish political reconciliation in Iraq as a critical element in our strategy against ISIS. We could imagine that we would do the same with Iran in Syria, to remove Assad and replace him with a leader, even an Alawite leader, who would be more prepared to reconcile with the Syrian opposition elements, Sunni elements there. And in that way we could have effectively a kind of joint condominium in which, in exchange for Iran's dropping of support for Hamas, its reining in of Hezbollah, and its cooperating in Iraq and Syria, we could re-establish some order based on that understandings between us. I think it's a fanciful idea, although there are many who believe that the nuclear deal could lead to such an outcome. The greatest exponent of this, by the way, is none other than Javad Zarif, the Iranian foreign minister, who was one of the authors of what was called back in George W. Bush's day the grand bargain that was offered by some in the Iranian regime to the White House back in those days. The grand bargain essentially looks like what I'm describing. And I always wonder, and I'm sure those conspiracy theorists surely believe, that what Kerry and Zarif are actually talking about is not a nuclear deal, but how they can divide up the Middle East between the United States and Iran. It's a fanciful approach because it's very clear from the way in which Iran is engaged in concerted efforts to establish its hegemony in the region through exploiting the disorder and promoting instability and using Hezbollah, using the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, and doing its best to promote chaos in the region. in the process, it is slowly but surely establishing its dominance in Lebanon, in Syria, or that part of Syria that's still controlled by the Iranian-backed regime, in Baghdad, and now increasingly in Yemen. So the notion that the Iranians are going to turn around and make a deal with the great Satan that would lead to the restoration of order in the region, it's a fanciful notion. And none of our traditional allies will accept it. Certainly not Israel, as we can see, and certainly not Saudi Arabia. So I do believe that there's only really one option. As difficult and as problematic as it is, it has many downsides, which I freely admit and will be happy to get into. But in essence, we have, in my view, no choice but to go back to the future and to return to an approach which builds on our traditional partners, restores their confidence in US leadership, and on that basis we work with them to try to restore the order in the region. There's nothing inconsistent between that and doing a deal which puts curbs on Iran's nuclear program, because that helps to reinforce the order and reduce the instability. If Iran were to acquire nuclear weapons, that would make things even worse than they are today, prompting a nuclear arms race in the region. And indeed, in the context of a nuclear deal, we need to reassure our strategic allies if we're to stop them from heading off in their own directions and pursuing their own remedies for a threat which they perceive as existential coming from Iran. So in that way, by reassuring them, by working with them, we can try to find ways to calm things down, to roll back the influence of Iran, and here's the final rub, in that way we can perhaps build on the fact that Israel and these Sunni Arab states share a very strong common interest now in the threats that they see emanating from Iran and from Hezbollah and from Hamas and from the Muslim Brotherhood and from ISIS, and build on that common interest to create a different kind of process that can help Israel achieve peace with its Palestinian neighbors. Thank you.
Ambassador Indyk is available for questions. And first I want to say thank you for a wonderfully enlightening insight into incredible complexity of the relationships and the pressures and cross-pressures in the Middle East. I'm going to step aside, and he's going to stand by the mic, but I'm going to sort of field questions. We have a couple of mics floating, so if you have a question, raise your hand. I want to say one thing. I want to give the students a chance first. We are an educational institution. We start there. So I'm going to first call on Michael Brenner to ask a question, and that, in the meantime, the students can gather your thoughts and find a mic.
Can I take off my coat?
Of course, and let me put it over your chair.
To be a student as well, as we all are, of course. Well, thank you very much also on behalf of the Center for Israel Studies for a, I think, really profound insight which gives a broader perspective, both in terms of time and geography. One question which is on many people's mind here, of course, is something you touched on briefly, and I would like you to elaborate a little bit, and that is the damaged U.S.-Israeli relationship in terms of the top leaders, who will both be in their functions for the next 2 years. And I just wonder how you assess the situation, what can be done to heal it.
Thank you, Michael. I'm deeply troubled by the state of U.S.-Israel relations, and it's as somebody that's worked on the U.S.-Israel relationship for the last, well, basically all of my life, 35 years. I came here first in 1982 to work on the U.S.-Israel relationship. I wrote my PhD on the U.S.-Israel relationship back in Australia. And one of the basic tenets of that relationship was the bipartisan nature of the support that Israel enjoyed in the United States. And what is being jeopardized now is that bipartisan support. It's being jeopardized because Israel is being turned into a wedge issue in American politics. And today, the Speaker of the House, John Boehner, is on a victory lap in Israel with the Prime Minister. And the way in which he organised for the Prime Minister to come and speak to the Congress so that the Prime Minister could attack the President's policy on Iran, the way it was done behind the back of the President of the United States in an unprecedented way, created a situation which I think puts the U.S.-Israel relationship into new territory. It's kind of uncharted waters. The fact that it was done 2 weeks before Israel's elections meant that not only was Israel inserted into American politics, but the United States was inserted into Israeli politics. And that is very bad for the relationship. I do not imagine that this dynamic in which Israel becomes a partisan football in American politics is going to change. I think that Republicans see an opportunity to embarrass Democrats, particularly in the context of the Iran deal, if there is one. Prime Minister has declared already, before there's a deal, that it's a very bad deal. He's denounced it again today. On Sunday, before his cabinet, he denounced it on behalf of humanity, and referred to the Iran, Lausanne, Yemen axis, kind of like an axis of evil. So it's quite clear that he's going to go to full battle stations, and the Republicans will go with him. And Democrats, who many of whom in the Senate I think will have doubts about this deal, will find themselves in a situation in which opposing the deal becomes a litmus test of their pro-Israel credentials, and supporting the deal becomes a litmus test of their pro-democratic or pro-presidential convictions. So it's a big mistake to put the Friends of Israel, Democratic Friends of Israel, in that position. They don't appreciate it, and it really undermines the situation. So what can be done about it? Well, I think that it's important that at least for the time being, the President and the Prime Minister have decided to cool it. And we haven't seen additional statements from the President since last week, and the Prime Minister has taken one important step to relieve the tensions, which was to hand over the tax revenues to the Palestinian Authority that he had been withholding for the last 3 months because of the Palestinians' move to sign the Rome Treaty and go to the International Criminal Court. That helps to stave off the collapse of the Palestinian Authority, and in that way will reduce at least one element of the tensions. We haven't yet seen what kind of government will be formed in Israel. If it's a right-wing government that pursues more settlement activity, which is, I think, to be expected, then I'm afraid that we're going to face even more tensions. So it's hard to see in the short term how this situation is going to improve, even if they're at least toning it down. There will be a confrontation. If there's a deal, there'll be a confrontation, an all-out confrontation between the Prime Minister of Israel and the President of the United States. If there's more settlement activity and an unwillingness of the new Israeli government when it's formed to move forward on a two-state solution, then there'll be tensions over that as well. And of course, there are many in the international community who enjoy this, who want to take advantage of it to further isolate Israel and, of course, to, in the case of Iran, to take advantage of that split in the region. So I find it a very troubling, very disturbing development. I think it's headed completely the wrong direction, and I wish that there would be a way to reverse it, but I don't see it. What I do see is that the relationship is critically important to Israel, and critically important in many ways to the United States, and so somehow we need to preserve the fundamentals of the relationship, particularly the security support that the United States gives Israel, and hope that we can weather the storm that's coming.
Dean, we have two questions from students in back here.
Okay.
Sir? Right here.
Hi.
No, I'm sorry. Sir.
Sorry, sir.
Back here.
Hi. I'm Dan. I'm an international relations major here at AU. I'm curious about what you think is going to happen to Saudi Arabia going forward, particularly its internal stability, and how do you rate the prospects for a political liberalization under the Saud family's monarchy, or for the prospects of a more violent political change being forced to happen in Saudi Arabia?
A long time ago, I used to lecture on Saudi Arabia back in Australia. I guess it was 40 years ago. And I used to try to explain to my students that there was no way, according to theories of political development, that Saudi Arabia that the Saudi royal family could remain in power in Saudi Arabia. That was 40 years ago. Another example of how good my predictive ability is when it comes to the Middle East. So what holds it together? Well, it's basically a pact between the Saudi royal family, which has large amounts of money to give out to buy off its population, and the Wahhabi religious leaders who provide the regime with its religious legitimacy. And that combination has proved to be a fairly potent one when it comes to containing the destabilizing forces of modernization in the kingdom. It's a very weird situation where you've got essentially a kind of 7th century social structure that exists within a 21st century gold-plated infrastructure. But so far it works until it doesn't. And that's the heart of your question, of course. And it's just hard to predict, but all I'm saying is they shouldn't be written off so easily. They do have considerable staying power. That said, they're in a very difficult situation. They feel encircled by Iran in the way that I described. The Yemen situation is a disaster for them, right on their borders. They've always been actively engaged in Yemen, playing the politics there to try to prevent a threat from arising to them. And now they're intervening militarily. And if that doesn't work, and it probably won't work, then they'll find themselves, I think, sucked into that quagmire in a way that could become highly unpopular at home and dangerous. On their other borders, they've got ISIS in Iraq. They've got in Bahrain a potentially unstable situation because of what I described there, the Sunni-Shia tensions. And, of course, they're facing a dramatic drop in the price of oil, which reduces their revenues. Now, they have plenty of reserves, not just oil reserves, they have plenty of financial reserves, but they can't go on forever like this. They depend on being able to buy off dissent in their population by huge subventions. And so they're in greater difficulty. Now there's a new king with a new son, who's the crown prince, who's leading the war in Yemen. They're kind of untested and unclear as to what they're going to do, how effective they're going to be. So I think it's a question. It remains a good question. For the time being, I think they will remain fairly stable, but the longer term prospects don't look good. But of course, they didn't look good 40 years ago either.
Over here in the far corner.
Yeah, hi. My name is Brandon. I'm a political science major here at AU. And I was wondering if, considering the strained relationship between Israel and the United States and Israel and Palestine today, what is the likelihood of the creation of a Palestinian state over the next few years? And how likely is that state, if it happens, if the negotiations succeed, what is the likelihood of that state becoming a democracy?
Well, I'll just refer you to Amos Perlmutter on the second part of your question. Look, the prospects are pretty dismal for any kind of successful Israeli-Palestinian negotiation leading to a two-state solution. And the premise of your question is exactly right, that a strong U.S.-Israel relationship is critical to the ability to make peace, because Israel is required to take considerable risks to make peace with the Palestinians. It's required to commit to withdrawing from most of the West Bank. And if you're familiar with the map and the terrain, that is a risky proposition. Now, there are ways of reducing the risks, but they require Israel to have a safety net from the United States and to be able to rely on that safety net. And if the United States and Israel are at loggerheads, and the Prime Minister of Israel is accusing the President of the United States of undermining Israel's security by doing this deal with Iran, that's highly problematic in terms of negotiating a deal in which the United States has to have the full trust of Israel for Israel to be able to move forward. But that's, in a way, the least of the problems. I, of course, had the honor to be Secretary Kerry's special envoy to the Israeli-Palestinian negotiations that ended almost exactly a year ago today. April 1st was last year was when the Palestinians signed accession to what was it, 50 organizations, international organizations, and that put the negotiations into a tailspin. A month later, they collapsed completely. The fundamental reasons for the failure of those negotiations abide today even more so, and that is a basic mistrust between the two leaders and between their peoples. The relationship between Netanyahu and Abu Mazen is a toxic one. They deeply mistrust the intentions of the other, and so the notion that these two could actually put those differences aside and make peace was one that we tried to test, and we found that it wasn't possible. Secondly, between the peoples, and that's in a way even more important. That distrust has developed over many years, and many years of disappointments on both sides, such that you have a situation in which majorities on both sides, you're probably familiar with this, support a two-state solution. But majorities on both sides do not believe that the other side wants it, that there is a partner on the other side. And that is as much true of the Palestinians' attitude towards Israelis, particularly an attitude that's driven by the settlement activity in the territories that the Palestinians consider will be theirs as part of a two-state solution. And of course on the Israeli side it's driven by the terrorism and by the history of Abu Mazen's unwillingness to show the courage in the final moments when it comes to actually making the deal. And so that combination means that neither side, the people on both sides, will not push their leaders to make peace. And as long as that is the case, these leaders, given the nature of their own relationship, are not going to do it. And so I'm afraid to say that for the time being, it's very hard to imagine that a deal can be done. And the best that the United States can do is try to preserve the two-state solution for another time when trust can be rebuilt, when leaders can lead their people to peace in a way that neither leader has been willing to do.
Okay, let's open it up to the general audience. Somebody on this side and then we'll sort of open. This gentleman. Would you stand, please? Or at least use the mic?
Sorry.
I just wanted to ask the ambassador if he knows people on the Palestinian side that want to make peace.
Sure. I believe that Abu Mazen wants to make peace. He's devoted his life to trying to make peace. But he is a man who now, people can laugh, but I can tell you from up close and personal that he is a man who has devoted his life to recognition of Israel and making peace with Israel. He was the architect of the Oslo Accords. He once told me that he doesn't believe that Arafat ever read them. In those days, he devoted a great deal of time and energy to understanding Israel. Passover is coming, and I can remember a time when he attended my Seder when I was the U.S. ambassador in Israel, and he spent the whole night quietly reading the whole Haggadah, because he said to me, I want to understand the Jewish people. He's very clear. He has no interest in seeking the destruction of Israel. He has no interest in, quote, flooding Israel with refugees. He has been quite determined in standing up against violence and terrorism amongst his own people. He has built, together with the help of the United States and Jordan, a security force that is dedicated to the proposition of maintaining security coordination with Israel. During the last war in Gaza, for 50 days, in which Hamas was firing rockets into Israel, but Israel was bombing Gaza and killing a lot of Palestinians in the process, he controlled the West Bank and prevented an outbreak of a third intifada. So that's on the one side. On the other side, he's a man who hasn't stood before his people in an election since 2006. Actually, 2005, presidential election. He does not feel that he has a mandate from his people. On the contrary, he feels that his people oppose him when it comes to making the necessary compromises that would lead to peace. And so it's a classic case of a situation in which he wants to, but he can't. And we saw that very clearly last year, March 17th, when the President had him in the White House, laid out to him our bridging proposals for a two-state solution, which should have elicited some kind of positive response from him, and we got nothing. He didn't respond. Now people say, well, that proves he doesn't want peace. No, it proves he didn't have the courage. And he didn't have the courage because he felt that his people were against him. He didn't have the legitimacy to make peace. And he didn't have the ability to stand in front of them and tell them, I got you 67 borders plus or minus the mutually agreed swaps and a capital in Jerusalem, but you've got to give up on the right of return. That's the kind of essential bargain here, which he wants theoretically, but he cannot sell to his people, doesn't have the ability to do that. And that's part of the tragedy of this situation. He rules over a divided polity. He only rules in the West Bank. He only rules in 40% of the West Bank. He doesn't rule in Gaza at all. He's got a hostile Hamas that's waiting to denounce him as a traitor if he does any kind of compromise with Israel. And so he's fundamentally weak and therefore is not in a position to make the deal. But it's not because he doesn't want to make peace with Israel.
Over here, the gentleman, yes.
I think this is on. Is it on?
We can hear you anyway.
I'm David Schrenbaum. I think I'm a party of one. I'd like to throw the ambassador a batting practice pitch. This is from a recent column of Tom Friedman's. America's interests lie not with either the Saudis or the Iranian ideologues winning, but rather with balancing the two against each other until they get exhausted enough to stop prosecuting their ancient Shiite, Sunni, Persian, Arab feud. Would you like to swing at the pitch?
I'm not good at baseball. I prefer cricket. Look, it's not as much as I admire Tom Friedman, it's not a viable strategy. What does it mean to balance Iran and Saudi Arabia? What does that mean? We just give Saudi Arabia enough support so it can stand up to Iran, and if Saudi Arabia is winning against Iran, so we support Iran against Saudi Arabia. I mean, as I say, we have to make a choice between who are going to be our friends in this situation and who are our enemies. And we can eventually turn Iran into our relationship with Iran into a situation of détente. But we are fundamental rivals, and we they're on the state sponsors of terrorism list for a reason, if they want to change their policies of support for terrorism and promotion of instability in the region, that's great. They're more than welcome. But if they're going to continue, as I fully expect they will, then we have only one choice, as I've said before. As difficult as that choice is, and that is to support our traditional allies and partners, which includes Saudi Arabia.
I think we had a hand up over there first, and then let's take this one.
Yes, a couple of questions. The countries in Europe have had quite strong movements for boycott, divestment, and sanctions. It looks like that's going to increase. Where do you see that going in the future? And the second part is the situation of the Israeli Arabs. They've been rather calm for a while. That seems to be changing. They do have 13 seats now in the Knesset. So where do you see the Israeli Arabs in this really volatile situation?
Yeah. Israel's isolation, I regret to say, is going to increase, especially because political conflict between the United States and Israel really just kind of opens the door to all sorts of bad actors seeking to isolate Israel. And if there's a right-wing government that doesn't pursue peace and does pursue settlement activity, then I think that the enemies of Israel will have a field day. The Palestinians will go to the International Criminal Court and to the UN Security Council, try to pass resolutions condemning Israel, and I'm not sure where the United States will stand if Israel is undertaking settlement activity that the United States so clearly opposes. So I think that is going to be a danger for Israel. But I don't think the BDS movement in itself is going to really have much impact. Obviously, it creates all sorts of tensions on campuses that you'll see maybe spreading to divestment movement, may spread in Europe. But I find it hard to believe that in itself is going to have a real impact. Israel has a very now powerful economy and strong trading relationships across the world. And so I don't see that as a kind of short-term danger. Over a prolonged period of time, it may be. The Israeli Arabs are a very interesting phenomenon and definitely worth watching. The fact that for the first time they were able to unite to become the third largest party in the Knesset. They have a leader who is smart, telegenic, moderate. He did not boycott the singing of the national anthem and the opening of the Knesset. And he has a clear mandate from his people to focus on their needs and not to focus on Palestinian nationalism that the Arab parties had for so long championed. And interestingly, he got an endorsement for doing so from Abu Mazen, who said publicly, you should focus on the needs of your community. And I think that will be a very important development for Israel's Arab sector. One which I think that the President of Israel is going to do his very best to encourage. There will be, inevitably, in Israel's raucous democracy, those who try to do their best to shut this down on the right. But I think that there's a real opportunity here for Israel's Arabs to feel like they have a real role and real rights in Israel, and I believe that Israeli society will respond positively to that effort. So I think that's the one kind of ray of light that I see in a pretty dark situation.
We have time for one more question. This gentleman here. Right, you sir with the mic.
Coming with the mic.
So it seems to me that over a very long time, the foreign policy establishment in this country has had the notion that if we could force out dictators like the Shah of Iran, like
Saddam Hussein.
Saddam Hussein, like you know the whole list. I don't have to recite it for you. That democracy would bloom, and you sort of indicated that you didn't exactly agree with that. What I don't understand is why so much of the foreign policy establishment has been thinking this way, even to the latest situation in what I would term the Arab nightmare rather than the Arab Spring. All these dictators being overthrown, our leadership saying, and democracy is going to bloom, and in my opinion, not as an expert, but sort of looking back, saying, gee, this was obvious from the beginning that every single thing that has happened would have happened the way it has happened.
I wish I had your prescience.
I said looking back.
Sorry, I didn't hear you. Look, I have to defend the foreign policy establishment. That is not their view. It's the democracy promotion establishment in this town that believed that it was important to spread democracy to the Middle East, and they had a pretty good case, especially when the people came out in the streets and demanded the overthrow of those dictators, and were standing up for freedom. How could we not support them, given who we are as Americans? So I don't think it's fair to, with the benefit of hindsight, say it was all a terrible mistake and we should have never done it. I think that what we actually did, if you think back to what I was arguing, was we actually supported the dictators in all sorts of ways, particularly Mubarak, but even Saddam Hussein. People forget that Ronald Reagan and in the Reagan administration was supporting Saddam Hussein against the Iranians. Even when he gassed his own people, we turned a blind eye to that. So we were prepared to tolerate a lot of bad behavior by these Sunni leaders on behalf of the principle that our strategic interests in the region required us to maintain stability and order. We put that first. Then we turned around and did the opposite, started to promote democracy, and then the Arab people took it into their own hands, and we supported them for a while. And so, we're caught between two strategies, neither of which have worked. It's not as if the strategy of promoting order instead of democracy worked so effectively. It begat instability, revolution. Wasn't the only reason, but the fundamental failure of our allies, the guys that we supported to meet the basic needs of their people, was the cause of the revolutions. So, it's the Middle East. There is no solution. There's just, a choice between bad options. And we have to find a way to kind of muddle through and do our best to promote our interests. Right now, our interest is to try to restore some stability, because the chaos that's spreading across the region is becoming a threat to our homeland. And so, therefore, I would argue we have to put stability first. But we shouldn't kid ourselves that that's a solution. It's just a temporary Band-Aid that could get us through this chaos to a point where then we should remember that we have to take care of the interests of the people of the region as well as our own interests. Thank you very much.